Police Credit Union for sponsoring our lead session in this entire lead series that we've done. For over 65 years, Police Credit Union has been providing financial solutions to take care of our own, exclusively serving law enforcement professionals and their family members throughout California. They proudly provide banking solutions, including checking accounts, home and auto loans, credit cards, online services, and more. As your financial partner, Police Credit Union is committed to helping you succeed financially, whatever your stage in life. So we thank them for being our exclusive one-source community financial partner and for sponsoring our lead series today. So my name is Sean Rundle, and welcome all. I'm the Deputy Director here at CPOA out of our office here in Sacramento. One of the hats I wear under that title is I am our lobbyist and our legislative affairs advocate, and so I'm well familiar with a lot of the pushes for these reforms, not just here, but since over the last few years. I've been here nearly 6 years. I started the day before Prop 47 passed, so since then I've seen that kind of wave that they've been pushing in Sacramento from that. So today's topic is certainly pertinent to that. This lead series was created as an immediate response to this COVID pandemic. We wanted to find a way to make sure that our members stayed connected, could share best practices, while the in-person ability to do that was somewhat taken away. This afternoon's conversation is use of force reform, the next wave, and we're grateful to have a number of subject matter participants that will lend some views into where we are, where we think we're going, where we've been. That includes the Southern California Force Instructors Association, Attorney David Demurjian, Dr. Ron Martinelli, and some others that can lend to the conversation today. So we're grateful for everyone's time. And this really is the next wave, because public safety reforms of the last few years in the Capitol were, I can tell you, more than anyone, they were dominated by AB 931 and last year AB 392 and SB 230. And just as we thought 2020 would be, honestly, we did think it would be a little bit of a breather for public safety, because we said, okay, they made those reforms, they're going to focus on some other things, education and housing and homelessness and everything else. And with the legislature come March fixed on the COVID response, we thought, okay, that's going to be their focus. And then, boom, the need George Floyd and subsequent protests and riots captivated the nation. And as always happens, with headlines comes legislation. So here we are. The legislators, I can tell you, in Sacramento will not rest until reform happens. Now, what that looks like is what we're working on, and what is feasible and what could work, especially in an election year. They want to go into November saying, okay, either my bill or I was part of this change. So it's definitely more pertinent this year as the second year legislative session and conducive with a election year. So the several members of the Southern California Force Instructors Association that are on the call today were gracious enough to call into our Law and Legislation Committee call this morning. A number of CPOA members that are part of our legislative committee, we discussed a number of different things, from reform proposals, which include de-escalation mandates, to carotid restraint removal, to crowd control response, to records release, and even how cops should dress in California. That's a bill being proposed. You can't look anything that resembles military. The key to all these reforms is that I think though is the need for proper training, and but of course you may have been crippled with drastic budget cuts, and an unfortunate consequence and casualty of that may have also been your training budget. So that leads us to our first poll question, which we'd like to put up, which will help kind of kick off this conversation. So if we could put up our poll question, we'll start with that. And we appreciate everyone's response to this poll question. We have a feeling we're familiar with what kind of the answer may be, but we want to throw this out first as our poll question. So this fiscal year, has your agency cut your training budget? Again, we fairly sure it may be a little bit of both, but we appreciate everyone's response. We'll give it about 30 seconds or so to let everyone respond to this question. So a number of people are responding, so I'll just give it another couple seconds here. Okay. So here's a pretty interesting breakout. About 32% of you, I think that's pretty telling that you unfortunately have had to cut your training budget. About 45% no, and the other half still, or 23% still in those negotiations. So pretty telling and relating to the conversation today. And so with that, I'd like to kind of begin this conversation by turning it over to some of our folks to lend their thoughts on where we are and where we're going. So Dr. Martinelli, if you don't mind, sir, I'll turn it over to you to begin with your thoughts. You're still on mute, sir.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. There we go. Technology's up, and I happen to be in our media room, for God's sake. So how embarrassing is that? Anyway, thanks very much. It's an honor to be here, especially being a retired California officer. And now, of course, our forensic death investigations and independent review team has a national footprint. And we get about 15% of everything you see on TV, these high-profile cases. The big case in California, for instance, the Stephon Clark case up in Sacramento, that's our team's case. Rodney King was my first case, by the way, so I'm going to date myself a little bit. So with these, and it's very telling to me that your responses today indicate that perhaps a third of the budgets for your departments are being reduced. And as I remember, and I've also directed a post academy, as I remember, the first thing to go in budgets is classically training. That's where they begin cutting back the most. And of course, with the political climate right now, to defund and actually move towards dissolving police departments, these pose real challenges. Quite succinctly, I will tell you with a global experience, which means going all the way from training all the way to litigation or criminal prosecution or criminal defense, it all begins with training. There is not a single case that I've had in 36 years, and I've investigated over 400 police-involved death cases, either OISs or ICDs. There's not a single case in that 36-year span where it didn't relate back to training. And so the thing that we need to have the most, as we all understand, is the first thing they're going to cut. Yet they expect more from us. And when you present as a subject matter expert or a PMK, a person most knowledgeable in your department, and you present before the trier of fact, who's going to be a jurist or a jury, you would be absolutely amazed at the unreal, first of all, the lack of knowledge of the trier of fact with regards to how police practices are conducted, especially as they relate to the use of force and Fourth Amendment issues, laws of arrest, search and seizure, things such as that. Because obviously, you know, use of force is a Fourth Amendment issue. But also the unreasonable expectations that the public has of law enforcement. They basically think we're the Avengers out there. I mean, there's nothing that we can't do. We can disarm people in hand-to-hand combat with knives. We can shoot at 100 yards and shoot guns out of people's hands, and we should wound people, and you know, all of this. And then the information that they lack about less lethal weaponry that we have, such as tasers, other less lethal munitions, chemical agents, things like that, is just astounding. And so, and generally, the problem that I see with use of force instructors, and then as it goes up to command staff and chiefs and sheriffs, is that they are mediocre at best at explaining to the trier of fact what we do for a living, why we are legally authorized to do it, and then issues such as jeopardy and preclusion. So if you look at Graham, if you look at Tennessee, if you look at Saucier, if you look at all these major fundamental cases that we have from the United States Supreme Court, with regards to the use of force, they deal with basically two issues. Number one, they deal with jeopardy. Is it imminent or is it potential? And number two, they deal with preclusion. What techniques, tactics, weapons can you effectively and successfully use, as opposed to what you can't. And we don't, because we're obstructed or prevented, right, from using it. So the first thing is we need to better educate our use of force instructors. And that's why I'm very pleased that Tracy McKenzie invited me to become a member of the use of force, Southern California use of force instructors. That's an amazing first step, and long time coming, by the way, as we all understand. But number two, we need better use of force methodologies in ways to explain use of force conceptually and actually and practically to not only the senior officers that we have on our staff, but this new generation of officers who, even though they might have been in the military, they are inexperienced. They're socially inexperienced, they're professionally inexperienced. And now my funding that is taking place and the problems that we are going to have with recruiting, because just a great example is New York City Police Department, which I have relationships with, reported that just in the last month, 809 people have put in for retirement. 809. That's huge. And now they literally have people having to make appointments to retire. So who is going to fill this void? And we're not going to find a lot of people that law enforcement resonates with. And so what they're going to do is they're going to do what they've done all along. They're going to start reducing standards. And when they reduce standards to bring people in, we are going to have a heck of a challenge trying to explain the use of Fourth Amendment issues, how it all begins, laws of arrest, search and seizure, and then the transition to uses of force. And how do we explain that to them so that they retain it, because these are all perishable skills. So that's just, the foundation of what I wanted to lay out there. And then I have a couple of solutions, but I'd like to hear from everybody else.
Mr. Demurjian, I'll turn it over to you. I know you've dealt with this, you've instructed some of the CPOA's courses on this. Where do you think about where we are and where we can be and how we got to this point?
Some of you know who I am, some of you don't. I guess the most important thing is I hear the fire department's now hiring and the benefits are pretty good. So please get a jump on that crowd out the door. And I know, and I joke about this, and most of you know my attitude is I'm very depressed over this, but I think now more so than ever, we have to lead. It is very rough. Recruiting, good luck. And as the doctor just said, the quality. I think the two most important ingredients for any good agency is, number one, the quality of the people you bring in, and number two, consistently good training. And as the doctor pointed out, in both civil and criminal litigation throughout the country, and I've tried cases in most of the major cities, New York, Boston, Chicago, and out here in LA, it always goes back to a training issue, which, taking that theme and taking this very negative attack upon the industry with a lot of disinformation and a lot of lies and a lot of public relations and a lot of politics attacking us for all the wrong reasons, I think the positive is this. I think that we have to unify, we have to re-engage, we have to get out in front of this, and we have to demand training. We absolutely have to demand training, because as the doctor pointed out, the first part of the budget they hit is the training budget, which I can show you the correlation. As soon as you hit your training budget and decrease it, you might as well bump up the other side of the curve, which is the litigation curve, because we'll be doing settlements because of the fact that we're poorly training people. Every single use of force we're seeing that's being publicized about throughout the country, almost every single one, I would argue is a result of a combination of maybe poor hiring. I haven't looked at the hiring packet, but most importantly, poor training. And if we can address that, particularly as trainers, and get in front of this and engage the politicians who do have a lot of disinformation in their own agenda in some cases in order to further their own cause, and be able to get out and actually link up and say, hey, we're in agreement. Training is absolutely essential. We're asking you for your help. We need it, and this is the kind of training that we need to put out there. And I'm not talking about it, training of like once in the academy or once every 2 years. I'm talking about, as I've said with a number of you guys, I know Jeff Wright in Ontario, Tracy at Newport, we all agree that it's consistently good training. And I want to be able to say that if we're able to start this momentum, which is, let's not push back against what's being said, but let's embrace it and take it and guide that energy towards making us a better agency, because we can always be better. Let's take that positive energy and do it. I said before we came on here, I know that we probably could stay here for several hours and talk about all the bad, and it is out there. I know it's bad. I can't even watch the news anymore. I no longer have hair. Whatever hair I had, I just can't watch anything in which I see disinformation and an attack upon the industry. But we can't get sucked into that, and that's why I think it's important for all of us to come to a common message, start educating ourselves better, and we have to educate to lead. We can't be hiding and disengaging. We have to be out in front. The other thing is, and we'll touch upon it later on, is I think we also have to redefine what our mission objectives are right now. There's been a very clear message, particularly San Francisco taking the lead, and I absolutely applaud it, which is disengaging us from the mental illness call. I do not, and I know that I'll get different responses on this. I do not think we should be rolling out to the mental illness call. And I know San Francisco's not having the police handle it anymore. And I've been saying it for years, I can't thank them enough for not sending the call us. Let fire or public health handle it. I think we're putting ourselves into a lot of problems by handling those calls. But let me table that right now so we can hear from everybody else.
What I'll say and by the way, I'm joining you pretty soon, and this is probably from the last 6 years. I'll be there not too shortly. Is what I've heard in legislative sessions from the last few years in committee meetings on use of force reform and everything else, is there's been times where some legislators saying, hold on here, is this just about training? Like, are we talking about training here, and do we need to properly, and in the last few years, they gave some money to post for de-escalation training per 392 and 230 and other things, but it often gets sidetracked once they get into these social reform pushes, and they almost seem to forget that it's about training, and especially for CPOA, whereas that's kind of our bread and butter in terms of our leadership development, is a focus on training and what we can do. That's been crucial to us, whether it's been going in front of the budget subcommittees and saying you need to fund not just training, you need to put back in general fund monies for local police departments, not tied to specific grants and things. You need to start funding these departments who are being crippled here, and barely able to get back to recession era staffing levels. So that's been a huge component of at least conversations from the last few years. But so I'll turn it over to Sergeant McKenzie or anyone else from the force instructors to see how these reforms that are being proposed and just the way things are right now, what do you anticipate being the needs for training, and whether it's a new wave of folks coming in, the new cops that are being hired, that are being recruited, where do you think we need to be getting on the training front? So Tracy, do you have anything, or anyone from the force instructors on this?
I'll touch a little bit on it. So our biggest issue, which everybody's facing, is the COVID issue. So we were actually on board to get on track with our defensive tactics program. I revamped the whole thing. I agree with the consistency and the repetitiveness of needing to do it more often. So we actually started to do like a 3 times a year plan, and we revamped the whole program, but COVID put a stop to everything. So I was going to ask, with the budget issue, I don't know if it's so much of a budget issue right now with training money, it's everything's on hold. So how do we combat that with today's times, with what we're facing with all this civil unrest stuff and this reform that's being demanded? We can't even begin to attack it because we're on hold with COVID. So I don't know how it's going to turn out next year, or when this all dies down. And I don't know what our budget's going to look like. But that's kind of how I see it right now, is COVID.
Anyone else from the Force Instructors Association on any thoughts that you have? What I'll tell you, so I mentioned that our legislative committee had a call this morning. Let me give you a brief overview, and you can jot some of these bill numbers down and take them back to your agencies that are some reform that's being proposed right now while the legislature. It looks like they're going to stay away from business till the end of July because a couple legislators themselves came down with COVID-19 and some of their staff as well. So they kind of closed the Capitol. But what I anticipate before the end of the August deadline to have all bills passed is that they're going to prioritize some of these things, and based off everything going on nationwide, they may place some of these use of force reforms at the top of the list. So Assembly Bill or AB 66, AB 66, that's a bill that's going to outlaw rubber bullets and basically your kinetic energy projectiles. So your rubber plastic bullets, the outlawing of CN tear gas, CS gas, basically you can only deploy those resources in an instance of a riot. So in a peaceful protest, a First Amendment protected protest, you can't use those, but obviously I don't have to tell you, it's so easy for one to turn into the other. And it was brought up this morning, a number of your folks could be dealing with some folks that are peaceful up in the front line, but somebody pops up right behind them and throws a brick at you. I mean, there's just some things that you just can't anticipate. So what's the proper response to these legislators really understand civil unrest and protests and everything like that? And while they're asking you to recognize that, 99.9% of protesters are peaceful protesters, well, why can't they recognize that 99.999% of you are doing the right thing and are good cops, and don't pigeonhole one specific incident across in another state or something related to California, who's already above the bar in terms of training. So AB 66 is a bill you should watch because that's the outlawing of those particular tools. The outlaw of the carotid restraint is AB 1196. That's going to basically say an agency shall not authorize a carotid restraint. So I know a number of agencies have taken it out of their policies already based off the governor's order, but that's another bill that you should be aware of is 1196. AB 1506 from Kevin McCarty here in Sacramento. That's a bill that it follows what DOJ can do now, but it basically says that the Attorney General can create a division to go in and do an independent use of force investigation. It's a specific office within his agency. But as you know, they can already come in if they want to do an independent one, but this kind of sets the stage for basically usurping a lot of the local DA powers to do their own investigation. So that's one that you should be watching. And in terms of the use of force, there's other ones being proposed. One that's really going to have an impact to municipalities and counties, especially the city office or the county office, is Assembly Bill 1314. That's going to basically say you're going to have to put up on your website all use of force settlements, what was paid out, how much, what the settlement and judgments were, broken up into if there were multiple recipients of some of these funds, what the municipal bonds were. So these things are going to be reported. And to give you an idea of where the legislature is tying some of these social reforms into issues that they don't really have any business being in, is Senate Bill 773, so SB 773. This is a bill that would remove one Cal Chiefs recipient and one advisory board placement, and one from state sheriffs on the 911 advisory board. Those associations each have 2 people. So it's going to take one position away from each of them and instead open it up to a mental health clinician or somebody from a social services agency. But this is a 911 advisory board. This is a board that's supposed to advise OES on the technical aspects of 911. How does this response, how does it get you the best response, and to get out there? And they put right there in the intent language that they're proposing, what Mr. Demurjian mentioned, is that the focus on a lot of these mental health responses is that they don't want it to go to you. They don't want you responding at all. So they don't want you even responding to that 911 call. But this is using that technical board about, how 911 should be used and putting that into it. So it gives you an idea of where they're going with this. And the legislator and the staff that I've spoken to have said, look, this is all part of this reform package that's being pushed in the Capitol, a lot of it by the Legislative Black Caucus, but There's some bills that they're going to want to see, the ones that I mentioned, all pushed together, because they don't think it's just one issue over the other. They're seeing it as a nice package wrapped up in a bow. So that's what you're going to be, kind of dealing with in the conversations you have to have at the local level about what your response is, and obviously where CPOA plays into that. So curious to see from any folks on the line what you're dealing with at your agency, if you have any thoughts, suggestions, and as the opening speakers mentioned, they want to all hear from you, as do we at CPOA. So anyone have any thoughts or recommendations or anything you're dealing with that would be helpful for everyone else?
Sean, can I mention something?
Hey.
Yeah, I totally support what David says with regards to changing the paradigm on the mental health response. Mental health is part of my forensic background. And I will share with everybody, and you'll find maybe this unbelievable, but right now I'm working 63 officer involved death cases, 63. And I will tell you all that 80% of those 63 cases, including one we are doing right now where the agency basically turned the investigation over to us, and it's a California agency because it's so high profile, that's 80% of all the officer involved shootings and in custody deaths on our caseload is a mental health. Some either SBCs, suicide by cops, psychomedical emergencies that started out with a pre-existing mental health problem. And so, I really do believe that we should reverse the way we're doing things, where, now law enforcement responds out there first, and then we stage, EMS. Or if we have a mental health component, civilian mental health component, we stage them, and for obvious reasons, because these are dangerous cases. But I think what we might want to think about doing is reverse that staging. And unless there is imminent jeopardy, I mean, not potential, because they're all potential, but imminent jeopardy, I think that we should send in the specially trained mental health teams, let them try to de-escalate, let them try to negotiate with these people. And then if the poop hits the blower, so to speak, that's when we come in, because then we can justify the imminent jeopardy to a third party. And believe me, that would mitigate so much civil litigation at the state and federal level, not to mention, criminal prosecutions against our officers that have encounters with mental health people that go sadly wrong, even though everything the officer is doing might be correct or the best that they can possibly do. They tend to be extremely high profile cases. So, I mean, I would just like to say that. And I have something to say about post-training if there's that opportunity that opens up.
Yeah, some interesting thoughts. And I know there's right now, and it was mentioned in, and thank you for the chat response too, to go off what Jeremy Hellwell mentioned, is right now with COVID being the focus, your defensive tactics training may have had to take a back seat to some other things, PSP training and everything else, but some of the post-mandated stuff. So how, they have to be aware of the situation as well. Just a minute ago, Javon Smith, did you have your hand up, sir? I thought I may have saw it. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, with our department, I'm one of our lead use of force, our defensive tactics officers. And the issue we're going on is the loss of the carotid. We've moved it into our deadly force category. However, our studies with our application of the carotid have been successful, especially when we're fighting people who are just, experience excited delirium. So with the training with that, we've talked about, we do a lot of things here where we get the community involved. We have Citizens Academy. We're even talking about trying to get in front of this with our community and maybe even posting online like, hey, this is why we use, this is an instant when we would use the carotid. And to show people, because I think a lot of people are in a perception like the carotid is a chokehold and from those of us who train relentlessly on it, we know it's not a chokehold. And we can say there's thousands of MMA gyms across the nation. This move is applied 100 times a day, but no one dies from it. And then we're trying to take more of an education approach with our community and let them understand, hey, this is why we had this in our tool belt. And this is kind of what I think we're gonna actually start doing it to our members of our Citizens Academy and our community, and let them know, like, hey, this is just to kind of clear things up. This is not a chokehold. This is a carotid restraint. It's, you know, there's two different meanings. And I think, you know, you get the mob mentality. One person says, oh, choke you out, I'm going to choke you out. And we're seeing doing it, and someone from the crowd yells, hey, he's choking him out. It's like, no, I'm not choking him out. It's a carotid. I'm saving this guy's life. Because we all know with excited delirium, they're ticking time bombs. They're going to die if they don't get the medical aid rendered to them. But also we're also in a position where our department realizes, like, since carotid got moved, if we get in a physical altercation with someone, you know, we're prepared to go back to like the old school days where it's going to be broken hands, orbitals, sockets. And it's like, is the world really ready for that? Like, one end, the carotid ends a fight within a matter of seconds, and now we're fighting with guys for 5 minutes, and it's not going to look pretty. So that's kind of like what we're dealing with.
Hey, Sean, can I mention something based on our conversations this morning?
Please.
Specific to the carotid, and Javon, kind of a piggyback on what you're talking about. So this morning we talked about how the carotid, it's probably not the best practice to remove it from the policies and keep it in there under the deadly force application. So I confirmed in ours, we use Lexapol. I don't know who everybody else uses. So ours does say under a deadly force encounter, we can do it. So this is my question. Maybe it's not the right forum, but since everybody's here, they might be able to give me some insight. I have the mindset of, if it's gonna be available as a weapon to say under a deadly force encounter, I'm of the mindset we should be teaching it. Now, I know post is mandated we remove it from all of our curriculum, which I've done. We've also, like I said, changed our policy. But my thought is if we don't train the officers how to use it, and an officer is in a deadly force encounter where that's the only option he's got because he's rolling on the ground with this guy, and I haven't taught him how to do it, he, for one, might get fatigued and overpowered and ultimately killed, or might get fatigued and ultimately go to a deadly force type of a thing like a firearm. So the carotid, if it's taught properly, could actually save a suspect's life and the officer's life. So my question is this. I think what I just said stands on its own. So are you guys in these other agencies, are you guys still going to be teaching it under the umbrella of deadly force? Because it's not allowed to be in our post curriculum anymore.
I want to answer your question, and I think the statement made before, both of you are factually 110% correct with what you're saying regarding the use of the carotid. You're both going to make outstanding firemen when you make the transition over to that agency. The problem is, and again, I'm speaking from my own experience. For 40 years, I've been in judo. I know what a carotid is. I'm lucky enough to go to Japan twice a year and train with the Tokyo Metropolitan Police. They've been teaching the carotid for 800 years. It's still there, and it's not in the deadly force category. So you're absolutely right. There's probably a carotid being put on right now somewhere in this country, and it's being done correctly because someone's teaching it. It is a brilliant compliance tool. To be called a chokehold shows the level of a person's ignorance, because it has absolutely nothing to do with choking somebody. It has a totally different application when taught correctly. Absolutely right. However, both of you are making the fatal assumption that the individuals you're talking with, in order to get this policy change, want to base it on a factual reason as opposed to the politics of what we're having right now. The use of the chokehold or anything near the carotid, they don't want you even teaching it. Is it an over reaction to the politics and to current events? Absolutely. Will the facts eventually hopefully come to light, and will we have policy reflective more of what you need to use this as a compliance tool? I hope to dear God you do, because it is, when taught correctly, a phenomenal tool and does decrease injuries, fatal injuries, to a lot of people who could end up getting more seriously hurt aside from a carotid. The unfortunate part, like I said, there's so much politics involved in this. As for you teaching it, my recommendation is I would not go near it. Now, it's unfortunate because, like I said, it is such a great tool. And if someone is fighting for their life, my assumption was all the time, all bets are off. I can do whatever is necessary in order to complete the mission. But the way I'm reading some of the stuff and the way I'm seeing some of the interpretations on the statute and the things I'm hearing, they don't even want you to discuss it, not even the principle of it. And that's even in the deadly force category, which I don't understand. Because again, going back to the fact that when it's deadly force, it's pretty much all bets are off. At that point, it's just survival mode. I don't know. And as a closing note, if they're going to eliminate the carotid because of its deadly force encounter, they technically cannot sanction any more UFC fights in the United States because then they're sanctioning death matches. That's been my logic behind the problem with them calling it a chokehold. And like I said, both of you are talking great facts, but I want you to sort of separate yourself away from that. And let's go back to the politics of what's being jammed down your throat right now. No pun intended. Because we're going to have to step it back and you're going to have to move away from carotid. The first speaker made a good point, which was it's going to go back to a lot of the punching. Yeah, we're going to see a lot more broken knuckles. The other prediction I have, because I was thinking about this yesterday, a lot of arm bars. We're going to see that, a lot of broken fingers on suspects. You're going to go back old school, and old school is because they've made the taser such a bad tool now. You can't do the taser unless Bryant versus McPherson time, aggressive and all that. And so what are you left with? Oh, the baton. That's of course courtesy of Roger Clark and his big mouth. And then pepper spray, of course, that's been put. So they're left back to these. And like you said, it's going to be ugly. It's going to be ugly because especially if someone knows how to throw a punch, there's going to be a lot more injuries. But we're all going to learn this through time. In the meantime, I think it's our responsibility as instructors is to minimize your risk profile. And when it comes to instructing, I think we have to step back away from that, even though you have some perfectly good reasons to teach on it. And you're going to have to just say it's a prohibition on any sort of technique in which the carotids are being restrained in any way whatsoever.
Hey, David, I've got a question for you. I'm not an attorney, but I stayed in a Holiday Inn once. So listen, when we're dealing, people that do what I do for a living, right? Subject matter experts in court, and any of these ladies and gentlemen that are here today essentially can be doing the same thing. But, we stand in the officer's shoes and we make determinations between, before the trier of fact. We never answer the ultimate question, okay? Because that's a trier of fact, is it objectively reasonable what they did? But, we do have to give opinions as to whether the officer's actions were in compliance with recognized, accepted, and applied codified standards of care, right? Law enforcement practices and standards of care. Once the state of California, vis-a-vis Post, removes the carotid restraint, that no longer becomes a codified standard of care. So we need to be very careful about that because they basically cut our legs out from under us. So, I can't, for instance, if I had a case, with this legislation, let's say it passes, and I think it is in California, it's going to pass for sure, where they remove it. How do these ladies and gentlemen, how do they stand and describe what the officer had to do in a life and death situation where he wasn't in compliance with the codified standard of care?
It's interesting, and you're right, because probably the way things look right now, it will get removed. So now let's put it into the field in reality. 2 o'clock in the morning, some poor cop sitting out there fighting for his life has pretty much used whatever you want to say, de-escalate a situation when someone's trying to kill him. And he just so happens to reach up and put the carotid on, and the carotid, and due to excited delirium, next thing you know, this guy dies. Can the cop be prosecuted for criminal prosecuted for murder? Absolutely, depending on the prosecutor, particularly with the penal code sections.
Mm-hmm.
Can they civilly be sued? Absolutely. In San Francisco County, LA County, with a jury pool down there, absolutely. They will probably be talking settlement in order to avoid the wrath of a jury from that jury pool. If you go to a different jurisdiction, a different jury pool, you might have a different result, civilly speaking. Policy-wise, he'll probably be in violation of his agency's policy and probably will get fired for it, and then we'll have to fight to get his job back. No matter what, and I think you said it best, they're cutting the legs out on the cops. In the real world, in which they have to work. And I hate to say it, and I don't want to be quoted, which of course is kind of crazy to say it, but if you're in a life or death situation, I don't care what you do in order to get through that. Later on, we'll sit and we'll figure out what has to be done in order to save your career. But if you're in that life or death situation, you have to do what it takes to survive. And if it is reaching up, putting on a carotid, if done correctly, technically the carotid won't kill you, because that's why it's a carotid, not a choke. But if you have to go to a choke, you do a choke, which is, you know, just an adjustment with your arm, and you put it on because you got to survive it. The unfortunate part is it's just no matter what happens, and I think, Doctor, you see it because of all the testifying you're doing, it's going to be a shitstorm, excuse the language, but no matter what use of force engagement you get yourself into, it's going to be, there's the potential of it to become high profile, and your career and everything about you might be on hold for several years.
You know, one of the things that I'm afraid of, ladies and gentlemen, and when I saw this happen with the carotid restraint, and I'm an instructor, I've written about it. Hopefully you've read my articles about it. But I will tell you that there's something that's coming to California that scares the bejesus out of me, and that is the concept of proportional force. Have you heard of that concept? Right? Have you not heard of proportional force? If you haven't, please do a little research and some Googling, because that's where some states are starting to talk about it. In other words, well, I mean, what's the concept of proportional force? You can't use any force that's greater than the force that's being used against you. So basically, if the guy is punching you, you can't pull out your baton and hit the guy with the baton, okay? Because now you're using something that's greater than a punch or a kick. So I'm just saying, you know, now that they've done this with the carotid restraint control hold, just write that term down, because it's coming down the pike. And because I get to do cases around the country and testify around the country, I see what's out there, and proportional force is coming. So please do yourselves a big favor, and when it arises, you should have a good answer for it. Okay?
I think the other thing we have to press with everybody, all the instructors, is, and I know most of you guys have been on for 10 years or more, I don't need to say it, but you're gonna have to teach everybody to start slowing their roll. There's no need to be rushing anymore. I honestly have a problem trying to figure out what should be code 3 with lights and siren. Particularly with the fact that in litigation, they're asking, did you utilize all resources prior to engaging? I mean, think about that. That is such an open-ended question. Some policies now in the state of California have force, comma, objective reasonable force based on the totality of circumstances, comma, and as a last resort. What does that mean then, and as a last resort? That means you have to use every possible other means instead of force itself. And force, as you know, is broadly defined from command to contact to the use of the firearm or a tool. So that's why I think we got to beat into everybody's head. You got to slow raise roll. A lot of slowing down. I know everybody, the unfortunate part is, I would say 99% of you took the job, but, particularly because you want to go help people. And there's that gene in your gene pool that wants to rush out there and stop evil people from doing bad things. Well, I hate to break it to you. You're gonna have to tamper that right now, and you're gonna have to slow it down, and you're gonna have to be very careful about how you get involved. And I know it's very easy for me to say it because I'm not in a black and white, but it is, too many of you are putting yourselves into a bad situation. And it's not that, it's not expected that you're gonna run into bad people, but I'm saying from a criminal prosecution standpoint, a civil liability standpoint, I'm having a problem trying to figure out what it is you should be rolling so hot and heavy to, outside of the fact that the fellow officer is being attacked. It is very difficult in this political environment right now to justify you risking your lives into something where I don't know what I'm going to do civilly to defend you, because the court's going to have a whole slew of questions of what you should have done prior to engaging the suspect, particularly if mental illness was mentioned anywhere in that call for service.
Yeah, great points. And if there's no other final thoughts, I put in the chat box some bills to note, the ones that I mentioned and some others, so jot those down. And as we respond, based off our conversation this morning, from the thoughts that our legislative committee had, I'm going to take those back to some of these legislators and their staff and see, by the time the legislature reconvenes, what thoughts they have about, going forward. But I think going back to the understanding, not just, to what Javon Smith mentioned about educating, their public and the communities, about educating some of the legislature, members of the legislature on what even de-escalation is, because I think they look at it backwards. They think from these big incidents you had to use de-escalation, when the fact is you de-escalate from the moment you get out of the car or the moment you walk up to somebody. You're de-escalating all the time in every response, in every call, because it's the general, it's human nature to be a little bit apprehensive when a cop is approaching you. So I think I think there's this misunderstanding just as they push these through, and I think going back to an earlier comment that Mr. Demurjian made about going back to really how are they playing into the politics here, as opposed to what's the actual meat and potatoes of what's actually being proposed, and do they understand what they're actually asking for? And that's where, what I can tell you, and I can obviously only speak for CQA, that's where we do our best to educate them on these things, because it's in our policy, our legislative platform is to educate them on these things. So any final thoughts from anyone before we convene? And I know this is kind of an ongoing conversation, one we plan to have as a part of our offerings, as part of our advanced training, our virtual conference coming up. So there's going to be more to come on this. But any final thoughts for today?
My name's Revamped.
Sean, I want to just butt in for a second, and I'd like to see another seminar like this. I think it was very helpful, but I'd like to see another seminar where maybe the use of force instructors could have some input on how the post-learning domains with regards to the use of force need to be changed. To give you a great example, 98% of all the officers in California have tasers. There's not even a learning domain that addresses tasers, right? Electronic energy. All right, that's ridiculous. So there's a lot of things that need to be revamped because they're forcing us to revamp. And I would very much welcome being involved in that type of discussion with these learned colleagues. So thank you very much for inviting me.
I'm going to take you up on that. Any other final thoughts?
Sean, I just want to say, obviously I was limited in my participation today. However, the more we can get our executives involved in this conversation, and the more they are willing to participate, I think the more information that can be shared. Being silent on the matter doesn't help us one bit. So let's be appropriate with our comments, but let's be heard. Allowing us not to be heard is not helping us. It's actually hindering us. Officers need to know what their options are. They need to know what they can and can't do. They need to know where they stand. If you take something away, give me something else. If there's a better way to train, please share it with me. And that's what we're trying to do. That was the basis of this moving forward. However, we need help and support from the top so that we can move forward and help these guys that are going to be out there doing it. As much as they don't want to respond, we have to respond. That's our job. That's our duty. It's going to happen. We are going to respond. Don't let me stand there with my hands in my pockets and my thumb up my butt trying to figure out what it is I can do. So it's frustrating, but that's all I have.
Thanks, Tracy. Stuart, did you have something, sir?
Sorry, yes. I was just talking about the de-escalation, dovetail off what David said. Our agency, we teach de-escalation, common study about pre-escalation, but what we're seeing throughout the state, this has to be kind of a top to the bottom, because we have a little joke we talk about. It's like, how many officers in this room get paid per commission per call? We see that rushing into a call. But then they say, well, my sergeant says this, my lieutenant says I got to keep moving. So I do feel like if we can slow it down and use David's thing, slow your roll, I think we're going to use less lethal force or force options, because now we're observing, we can bring in the proper help that we need. So anyway, I'm not sure how to get to the top, but I think it has to be a top down through the academy, through the command staff.
Yeah, agreed. And again, through CQA's network of being, in our unique ability to represent everybody, I think it's incumbent upon us to bring executives and frontline staff together on this conversation. So it will be ongoing, and look for more to come from us, but for everyone's participation today, we greatly appreciate it, and be safe out there going forward, and hope you tune in next week for a seminar with Chief Neil Gang of Pinole on the 7-point approach to wellness, and keeping the morale up and keeping the profession going. But thank you all for your time, and wish everyone to stay safe out there.